In the remote countryside, a dilapidated wooden house stood still like a silent witness to terror. But when the police crossed the rotting threshold, the dense stench of death emanating from within warned them that this was no ordinary abandoned house. The body of a young girl, tightly bound, lay on the cold floor, so decomposed that she was unrecognizable. Her skin had peeled away, and her face had been disfigured by time. Surrounding her was a chilling silence, but the crime still lingered in the air. No one knew what the girl had endured in the final days of her life. But the muddy footprints on the floor, the shattered wine bottles, and the fragments of mysterious whispers told a story darker than anything the police could have imagined. This was no random death, it was the result of a meticulous plan, a trap laid out in advance. The girl had been lured into it without knowing. What was more terrifying, the perpetrator was still at large, their shadow still looming over every corner of this house. Was this just the beginning of a larger chain of crimes? What mistake had the girl made to meet such a gruesome fate? The police knew they were facing a case unlike any they had ever encountered, a case where the answers lay deep within the shadows of betrayal and conspiracy. Emily, with her flowing blonde hair, slender figure, and radiant face, was always the center of attention. At 26, she had lived a life full of adventure and experience, unafraid to challenge anything new. Her friends adored her for her courage and strong personality, but they often worried about her bold and impulsive decisions. Emily believed life was short, and she never missed a chance to enjoy every moment of it. That night, the party was held in a penthouse in the heart of the city, where successful young people like her frequently gathered. The air was thick with the smell of wine, cigarette smoke, and pounding music from the speakers, mingling with the laughter of the drunken crowd. As usual, Emily shone in the crowd, laughing and dancing without rest. She had a few cocktails, feeling the excitement surge as the alcohol began to take effect. But amid the lively party, something caught her attention. In the corner of the room stood a black man quietly observing. Unlike the other men at the party, those who flirted with her with lustful eyes or shallow advances, he carried a different, serene aura. The white shirt he wore contrasted sharply against his dark skin, and his eyes were deep, as if hiding secrets she couldn't decipher. He wasn't trying to attract attention, but his cold demeanor only drew Emily in. She had always been fascinated by mystery, and this man seemed like a puzzle she was eager to solve. Emily decided to approach him, the thrill building as she made her way through the noisy crowd. Their conversation began simply, with a few brief social exchanges. He answered her questions calmly but revealed little about himself. She learned that he was new to the city and didn't know many people there, which only deepened the air of mystery around him in her eyes. In the heat of the moment, fueled by alcohol and instant attraction, Emily proposed a one-night stand. She wasn't looking for love or a long-term relationship, just a fleeting moment to add to the experiences she always craved. The man agreed, quickly and without hesitation, making Emily feel as though she had conquered something new. When they decided to leave the party, Emily told no one. To her, it was just a brief adventure, and she believed she would return the next day, sharing the story with her friends as one of the exciting tales of her life. She had no doubt, no fear, she was used to controlling everything in her life, and tonight was no exception. The man drove Emily out of the city. She looked out the window, watching as the streetlights gradually faded, replaced by endless fields stretching beneath the pale moonlight. The road narrowed, and cold wind seeped through the cracks in the car door, giving her a slight shiver, but she quickly brushed it off. It's just a fun night, she told herself, trying to hold on to the initial excitement. However, as they ventured deeper into the countryside, the atmosphere began to change. The surroundings became more desolate, and the sparse houses disappeared from view. Only darkness and the sound of the car's engine rolling over the rough dirt road remained. Emily felt a twinge of anxiety creeping in, but she tried to stay calm, believing it was all part of the adventure. When they arrived, the house appeared like a ghost in the night. It was an old wooden house with cracked roof tiles, showing no signs of life. The faint moonlight cast eerie shadows on the broken windows, stepped out first, and opened the door for her with a faint smile. Emily stepped out of the car, her high heels sinking into the damp, muddy earth. The wind blew through, lifting her hair, and a chill ran down her spine. For a moment, Emily paused, her eyes fixed on the empty house in front of her. A vague intuition told her something wasn't right. But she was too deep in this game to turn back now. She smiled, reassuring herself that this was just another fun night, then followed the mysterious man into the house. But tonight wasn't going to be fun. What awaited Emily inside this desolate wooden house would be unlike anything she had ever experienced. This wasn't an adventure, it was a deadly trap she never saw coming. Emily sat on an old couch, feeling the cold air from the wooden floor seep into her body. The man poured her a glass of red wine, and she took a large sip, hoping the burning liquid would dispel the suffocating atmosphere around her. His eyes were fixed on her, filled with mystery but also something that made her uneasy. The room was dark, lit only by a dim lamp, casting strange shadows on the walls. Emily sensed a difference in the air, the eerie silence of the remote countryside, a stark contrast to the lively noise of the party earlier. But she tried to push away the unease, reminding herself that this was just another casual sexual encounter, like so many before. The man sat down next to her, his hand gently touching her shoulder, sliding down to her waist, then resting on her back. The strong sensation of his touch made Emily shudder, but it was a shudder mixed with both excitement and apprehension. He pulled her closer, their lips meeting in passionate kisses. His breath brushed her ear, sending waves of stimulation through her body. They began undressing each other, each layer of clothing quickly removed, and the sound of fabric hitting the wooden floor echoed in the still room. His body pressed against hers, strong and slightly rough. His hands glided over her skin, each touch making Emily feel as if he was completely possessing her. But the initial excitement was gradually replaced by a growing tension, as if something was wrong, though she couldn't quite place it. Just as her suspicion began to grow, the door suddenly burst open, shattering the silence. Emily jumped, turning her head toward the door. Two other men entered, both tall, with cold, threatening eyes. She tried to pull the blanket up to cover herself, panicking as she asked the man beside her, "What's happening?" But instead of answering, he simply stood up, the smile on his face transforming into a cruel, calculating grin. "Did you really think it was just the two of us tonight?" His voice had turned chillingly cold. Emily looked at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her anxiety quickly turned into panic. She pleaded for help from him, but he only crossed his arms, watching with a triumphant look in his eyes. "You're not the only victim. Don't worry, you won't be alone for long," he said mercilessly. Everything around Emily suddenly became more terrifying than ever, and she knew she had fallen into a trap. The two men approached her, and in a moment of desperation, Emily screamed for help. She struggled, but they quickly tied her hands and feet. She lay on the couch, completely helpless as the three men began to turn her into their sick, twisted game. Their brutality didn't stop, they took turns raping and torturing her for hours, with no mercy or compassion. Emily wasn't just turned into prey for their perverted desires, she was imprisoned in this house for days afterward. They took turns torturing her both physically and mentally, gradually stripping away any hope she had of escaping. The days passed like an endless nightmare, her body weakening, and bit by bit, she realized she would never return to her old life. In the brief moments of clarity, Emily thought about her previous life, the party, the friends she never got to say goodbye to, and the impulsive excitement that had led her into this situation. She felt regret, but it was too late. The fleeting excitement had cost her everything, and now her life was being consumed, moment by moment, by fear and pain. When they felt that Emily was no longer of use, they decided to end her life. The young woman, once radiant and strong, was now nothing but an empty shell, brutally murdered to cover up their tracks. In that desolate house, Emily died in solitude, her final moments filled with terror that clung to her until her last breath. After several days of her disappearance, Emily's friends and family began to worry. No one had heard from her since the last party. All calls and messages went unanswered, as if she had vanished off the face of the earth. Her friends, used to her adventurous nature, initially thought she was just off somewhere enjoying her latest escapade and would return when she felt like it. But as the days passed without any sign of Emily, their mild concern gradually turned into fear. The police became involved after her family filed a report. They gathered information from those who had attended the party that night, but no one clearly remembered who Emily had left with or when she had departed. The details were muddled, and the initial leads were virtually non-existent. Every attempt by the police to find her ended in dead ends. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of an attack, and most importantly, no witnesses who saw her leave the party with anyone. 4 days later, a local resident in a rural area called the police to report a foul odor emanating from an abandoned wooden house. The smell had become unbearable, to the point where no one could stand it any longer. When the police arrived at the scene, what they discovered sent chills through the entire investigation team. The wooden house stood isolated in the middle of the countryside, surrounded only by weeds and dense trees. There were no signs of life around the house, except for the stench that rose from within. The police had to don gloves and masks before entering. The rotting door creaked open, and immediately they were hit by the overpowering smell of death. Flies swarmed around, clinging to the windows and the cracks in the walls. The police moved cautiously into the house, taking care as the wooden floorboards had rotted. There was little inside, just a few discarded items, an old table, empty wine bottles, and dust covering everything. But the truly horrifying sight awaited them in the last room. The body of a young woman lay on the floor, severely decomposed, her hands and feet bound tightly. Her face was nearly unrecognizable, with skin peeling away, and the stench filled the entire room. The girl lay in a twisted position of agony, as if she had endured prolonged torture before her death. Bruises were still visible on her neck and body, evidence of a brutal attack. The police realized they were facing a horrific murder. The young woman's body had been so badly damaged it was difficult to identify her, but from the initial clues, her clothing, some remaining accessories, they were able to confirm that the victim was Emily, the girl who had been missing for several days. The investigation began to uncover a story darker than anything the police had ever faced. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, and the items within provided little information about the identities of the killers. There were no security cameras in the remote area, and the locals were largely unaware of the house's existence. However, the police began searching for other clues: muddy footprints on the floor, dried bloodstains, and marks left on the ropes that bound her. They also managed to collect a few faint fingerprints from the empty wine bottles scattered around the house, hoping they would help identify the perpetrators. But everything seemed tenuous and difficult, as though the crime had been meticulously planned. The investigation entered a tense phase as the police confronted the grim reality at the abandoned house. Emily's body was taken for a forensic examination, but the advanced state of decomposition made determining the cause of death difficult. However, it was undeniable that Emily had suffered immense pain before she died. The injuries from prolonged torture and captivity made it clear to the team that this wasn't just a murder, it was a meticulously planned act of cruelty. The faint fingerprints collected from the empty wine bottles and the muddy footprints on the floor began to offer the police some critical leads. They found that the footprints matched a common brand of sneakers sold widely, but it wasn't easy to identify the wearer. All the evidence seemed faint, indicating the perpetrators had prepared thoroughly to leave as few traces as possible. As the police analyzed the evidence, the detectives realized the case was more complex than they had initially thought. The remote location of the house suggested that Emily had been lured there as part of a sophisticated plan. A team of detectives was assigned to dig deeper into Emily's life, hoping to uncover any clues about the people she might have encountered on the night of her disappearance. Through statements from Emily's friends, the police began piecing together the events of the fateful night she vanished. The accounts were vague, but one detail stood out: Emily had approached and left the party with a mysterious man that no one could clearly recall. Some described him as tall, black, and with an enigmatic appearance. However, no one knew his name or any specific details, only that he wasn't a familiar face within Emily's social circle. A final witness's testimony gave the police a breakthrough. A close friend of Emily's remembered seeing her talking to a stranger that night, a man who didn't seem to be an official guest at the party. They had spoken for quite some time and left together. This helped the police confirm that the mysterious man was directly connected to Emily's disappearance and murder. The detectives decided to investigate the guest list from the party, focusing particularly on those who weren't officially invited. By reviewing security footage from around the party's location, they discovered a blurry video of a car parked near the building at the time Emily left. The car didn't belong to any of the registered guests, and though the license plate was unclear, the police believed it might have been the vehicle used to transport Emily to the abandoned house. The investigation began to focus more intensely on identifying the mysterious man. Detectives reviewed all security camera footage along the route leading to the house, hoping to spot the suspicious vehicle. They also expanded their search into records related to similar assault cases, trying to find connections between past incidents and Emily's case. During their investigation, they discovered that the abandoned house had once been rented by a group of unidentified individuals, but the ownership records were vague and difficult to trace. By narrowing down the list of suspects, the police began looking into organized crime groups and individuals responsible for similar crimes in the area. These criminals often took advantage of remote areas to commit their acts unnoticed, and Emily's case seemed to fit their modus operandi. It became increasingly clear that this was not a random murder but part of a larger, organized crime operation. Meanwhile, the pressure intensified as the media began covering the case. The horrific images from the crime scene shocked the public. Emily's family made public appeals for help, hoping that witnesses or someone with information about her killers would come forward. The police were working under immense pressure from both the media and the public, knowing that each passing day brought the culprit closer to escaping justice. After days of searching and analyzing leads, the police finally made a significant breakthrough when they identified the suspicious vehicle through a video from a gas station not far from the abandoned house. The car, with its blurry license plate visible in the footage, became a key piece of evidence that led them to Marcus, a man previously arrested for minor offenses. The police began investigating Marcus further. His record showed a history of petty crimes, but nothing that would make him a prime suspect in Emily's murder. However, with the new evidence, Marcus was placed under intensive scrutiny. A team of detectives was assigned to surveil Marcus. Throughout the surveillance, the police discovered that Marcus had shady connections with a group of individuals. These were not ordinary people, they were linked to organized crime activities. Marcus frequently met with this group at a small bar in the suburbs, known as a hub for drug dealers and other illegal activities. As the police continued monitoring this group, things began to fall into place. Marcus's meetings weren't just casual conversations. They discussed dark plans, exchanged money, and appeared to be part of a larger network of operations. Suspicions that Marcus wasn't the mastermind behind Emily's case were soon confirmed. He seemed to be just a small cog in a well-organized criminal machine, whose operations were carefully hidden. At the same time, the forensic team conducted a more thorough analysis of the evidence collected at the crime scene. One crucial discovery was a fingerprint on an empty wine bottle. When cross-checked against the database, the fingerprint matched Marcus, confirming his presence at the scene during the crime. For the police, this was irrefutable evidence. Based on this evidence, a special unit was mobilized to arrest Marcus. The arrest was swift and unexpected, leaving Marcus no time to escape. Once at the police station, Marcus was separated and interrogated by top detectives. Although he initially tried to maintain a cold demeanor, denying any involvement, the pressure from the questioning and the undeniable evidence began to make him anxious. Marcus claimed that on the night of Emily's disappearance, his car had been borrowed by a friend. However, When confronted with the fingerprint evidence from the house, Marcus shifted his story. He repeatedly offered excuses, trying to create a different narrative to avoid being charged. But Marcus's false calm couldn't hide the fact that he was involved in the crime. In a tense, drawn-out interrogation, Marcus eventually cracked under the pressure and revealed part of the truth. He admitted to being at the abandoned house on the night Emily was killed, but he wasn't the mastermind. Marcus confessed that he was only a small part of a larger plan, controlled by others. These individuals often lured young victims by creating seemingly harmless situations, only to exploit their trust and turn them into prey for brutal acts. Marcus also disclosed that the abandoned house had been used for dark activities like this before. The criminal group had been operating for a long time, selecting victims like Emily, those who were easily enticed by novelty, adventure, and who lacked strong social ties to be immediately reported missing. Every word from Marcus sent chills down the police officer's spines. He not only admitted his involvement but also named two other men who had been present at the abandoned house when Emily was held captive. His descriptions perfectly matched the witnesses' accounts of the man seen leaving the party with Emily. Based on this information, the police quickly expanded their investigation. They soon identified the two men Marcus had mentioned. One was a known sexual predator with a criminal history who had been jailed but later released due to insufficient evidence in a previous case. The other was a drifter with no fixed address, frequently moving to avoid detection. Both men were connected to Marcus and the criminal group he was involved with. Identifying them was just the first step in a larger battle against a hidden criminal network. Meanwhile, the police faced increasing difficulty as the perpetrators tried to erase their tracks. They knew that Marcus had been arrested and might betray them at any moment, prompting them to start moving and concealing information. For the detectives, it became a race against time to catch them before they disappeared from the radar. The investigation gradually unveiled a horrific chain of crimes that had spanned years, with many victims who had vanished in similar circumstances to Emily. But what terrified the police the most was the sophistication and brutality of the organization. They had mastered the art of exploiting victims' trust and vulnerability to commit their heinous acts without leaving clear evidence. The deeper the investigation went, the more the police realized that Emily's case was only the tip of the iceberg. This group had been operating for years without detection, and Emily wasn't their first victim, nor would she be the last if they weren't stopped. After gathering enough information from Marcus, the police knew they were up against a far more dangerous and complex criminal network than they had initially thought. The perpetrators weren't just responsible for Emily's abduction and murder but were linked to a series of similar crimes. Emily was just one of many unfortunate victims, and the police had to race against time to stop them before they claimed another. The investigation continued to expand. The police delved deeper into the connections between Marcus and the criminal group. Based on Marcus's testimony, the detectives had the names and identification of two other perpetrators present at the wooden house on the night Emily was killed. However, apprehending them was another matter entirely. These individuals were extremely cunning, constantly changing their hideouts and possessing various means to evade capture. The detective team assigned to track these two men divided the investigation into smaller branches, following each trace from their past social interactions. One of the suspects, with a history of sexual violence, lived a transient lifestyle and had been involved in similar crimes in the past. However, due to a lack of evidence, he had slipped through the cracks of the legal system. This made it even more difficult to capture him as he continuously disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, the police focused on dismantling the larger criminal network. These individuals didn't randomly attack women. They operated systematically, selecting potential victims, luring them through social connections or party networks, and turning them into prey for their twisted games. Victims like Emily were often drawn into seemingly harmless encounters, only to be held captive, tortured, and eventually killed to cover up the crimes. The masterminds of this organization seemed to run a well-oiled machine, from finding victims, hiding their identities, to destroying all evidence after each crime. With each crime committed, they altered their tactics, changed hideouts, and adapted their methods, making it extremely difficult to track them down. Through careful surveillance and investigation, the police uncovered a suspicious location, a rundown house in the outskirts that, according to Marcus, had once been used as a secret meeting place where they carried out brutal acts on their victims. The raid on this house took place in the dead of night, with a special forces team. They approached the house quietly, weapons in hand, ready to confront the criminals. The house stood at the end of a desolate dirt road, surrounded by thick trees. The dim moonlight only illuminated part of the house, casting an eerie and haunting atmosphere. As the team approached, they found the house abandoned, but inside, there were many signs that it had once been the group's hideout. Evidence of captivity remained on the walls, old bloodstains seeped from the rotting wooden floor, and discarded ropes were strewn across the room. Although the house had been vacated, important documents and clues were found. Among them were records of victim selection, lists of potential targets, and, most disturbingly, photos of past victims, including Emily, preserved in a sickening manner. The police discovered that the group didn't confine their victims to one location but had multiple places where they hid their captives and committed their crimes. The investigation didn't stop there. The discoveries at the old house opened up a new direction, organized criminal gangs connected across a broader network. More locations began to be raided, and the police increasingly realized the horrifying scale of this organization. What had initially been considered a single murder case had now become a series of connected crimes, with numerous victims who may have been killed or were still being held captive. The detectives faced tremendous pressure as the case gained public attention. The media exploded with reports on Emily's case, and each new detail stirred more public outrage. Families of other victims began coming forward, demanding that the police re-examine other related missing persons cases, while the public urged authorities to quickly apprehend those behind the organization. The pressure mounted, but the police couldn't afford to act hastily. They needed to ensure that they would take down the entire organization, not just lower-level members like Marcus, but also the masterminds pulling the strings from the shadows. This required a detailed plan and close coordination between various investigative units. The hunt for the remaining members became more intense. The police began scrutinizing all of Marcus's connections, monitoring bank transactions, analyzing phone records, and checking lists of other suspicious locations. Raids were carried out one after another, and the members of the organization were gradually brought to light. However, as they arrested these criminals, the police realized the case was far more complicated. These individuals were part of a much larger crime syndicate, with numerous branches operating across the region. Similar assaults and murders had occurred in different locations, and each time the police captured a criminal, they uncovered new victims and more sinister plans. The pursuit was far from over, and the police understood they were dealing not with a small group but a dangerous, large-scale criminal network. Still, Emily's case had begun to reveal the larger picture of the organization, and they knew that without timely intervention, many more victims would fall into their hands. The hunt for the remaining members behind Emily's death dragged on for weeks, full of tension and intensity. The police threw all their resources into finding every last perpetrator, not just those directly involved in Emily's murder but also those within the broader criminal network. They knew that if they didn't act quickly and precisely, these individuals would find a way to escape and continue committing their heinous crimes. The investigation exposed even darker truths. Those behind this organization weren't just depraved sexual predators but also individuals involved in human trafficking, torture, and murder for other dark purposes. Numerous missing persons cases in the area, previously thought to be isolated, were now being reconsidered under an entirely different lens. Emily was just one of many victims that this organization had targeted and killed. Based on the information gathered from interrogating Marcus and other members of the organization, the police discovered that the wooden house where Emily was held wasn't the only location used. The group had a network of abandoned houses and secret locations scattered across remote countryside areas, used to hold, torture, and eventually kill their victims. These locations were out of the reach of local authorities, often abandoned or rented under fake identities to avoid detection. A large-scale raid was organized on one of the suspected locations that the police had uncovered through surveillance of the group's members. This location was deep in the forest, surrounded by dense trees and far from any residential areas. The Special Forces team, fully armed, entered the area at night to ensure the element of surprise. They knew this could be the final hideout of the organization's leaders, and the pursuit could lead to a brutal confrontation. The house stood quietly in the forest, faint light leaking from within. The Special Forces team quickly surrounded and entered. The sound of cautious footsteps echoed in the darkness, guns at the ready. When they stormed inside, the scene they found was chilling. The perpetrators were caught off guard and arrested on the spot. Inside the house, the police found clear evidence that the victims had been held and tortured there. Cold iron beds, torture instruments, and the dry blood stains on the floor all pointed to this being one of the main locations the group used to carry out their heinous crimes. Harsh interrogations followed. The captured members of the organization were questioned and forced to reveal the full scope of their operations. What the police uncovered was even more horrifying than they had imagined. This group had been active for years, carefully selecting victims from lavish parties, social events, and even through social media. They targeted young, independent women who lacked strong connections with family or friends, making them easy prey for seemingly innocent encounters. The investigation had finally unraveled a dark and horrifying truth. Emily's case was not an isolated incident but part of a vast, well-organized criminal enterprise that had been exploiting vulnerable women for years. But the crimes of this organization didn't stop at the torture and murder of their victims. Some members were also linked to human trafficking networks, using the victims not only for sexual purposes but also selling them to black markets overseas. Women like Emily, when captured, faced not only a cruel death but the possibility of being sold and vanishing forever within these trafficking rings. This was a complex, sophisticated, and brutal criminal system. The hunt finally concluded when the leaders of the organization were arrested and faced a slew of charges, from kidnapping, torture, and human trafficking, to serial murder. Each day brought more information to light, helping the police to expand their investigation and capture more members of the organization. Past missing person cases, once thought to be isolated, were now being solved as more victims were found, or at least leads on their fate emerged. When the trial began, the public was outraged by the cruelty of the criminal organization. Emily's family, along with the families of other victims, had the chance to confront those who had destroyed their loved ones' lives. The chilling testimonies of witnesses and the overwhelming evidence presented in court created a heavy and tense atmosphere. In the end, the members of the criminal organization were handed severe sentences. The ringleader, who orchestrated the entire operation, was sentenced to death, while the other accomplices received life sentences without parole. The case was closed, but the scars and pain remained, especially for the families of the victims. Emily's case was not just about finding her murderer, it also opened a new chapter in the fight against human trafficking and underground criminal organizations. What the police and the public uncovered through this case changed society's perception of hidden threats, organized crime operating right within modern society, unseen by most. Although justice was served, the emotional wounds left by the case would linger in the minds of those involved. Emily's case served not only as a lesson in vigilance but as a painful reminder of the brutality lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike. While the case officially ended with the criminal organization dismantled and the culprits brought to justice, the grief remained. Emily's death left a void that couldn't be filled, and her family, friends, and society as a whole were left to grapple with the aftermath. Her case was not just a horrific crime but a reflection of the cold, calculated cruelty of predators operating in the dark. Emily's family lived in turmoil and sorrow from the moment she went missing until her body was found in that desolate house. Her mother couldn't accept the reality that her daughter had died under such tragic circumstances. The police returned Emily's belongings to the family. The last thing she had touched before her life was brutally taken. Emily's funeral was a somber affair, filled with grief but also an outpouring of love from those who cherished her. The funeral became a place where the community shared the immense loss that Emily's family had suffered. Those who attended came not only to say goodbye to a young woman but also to express their anger toward the monsters responsible for her death. Tears flowed down the faces of family and friends, and promises were made to never let this crime be forgotten. Even though justice had been served, the void left by Emily's death could never be filled. Her family had to live with the pain each day, facing the truth that their daughter had become a victim of a criminal system they never could have imagined. The happy days and memories of Emily were now only fragments in their minds, making the pain even deeper. It wasn't just Emily's family that had to come to terms with the aftermath. The community and society as a whole faced the consequences of this case. Emily's murder shocked the public and sparked a broader conversation about security, vigilance, and the hidden dangers in modern society. Discussions about online crime, the ease of forming connections with strangers, and how criminal organizations operate were now at the forefront of public discourse. Emily's case served as a warning for many young people, reminding them of the dangers lurking even in seemingly harmless situations. Local authorities and law enforcement agencies were forced to reevaluate how security systems operated, particularly in remote areas where criminals easily took advantage of the lack of oversight to carry out their heinous acts. New regulations regarding surveillance, cameras, and alarm systems were discussed and swiftly implemented. This reduced the risk of similar crimes, but it also highlighted the long battle ahead against crime. The media continued to cover Emily's story, not only to draw attention but also to raise awareness of the invisible dangers in society. Articles, investigative reports, and programs about the case exposed the methods used by criminal organizations, showing how predators exploited the weakness and trust of their victims. Emily's case became a hot topic across media platforms, discussed on forums and social networks. Numerous NGOs and human rights groups rallied to push forward projects focused on preventing violence, sexual crimes, and especially human trafficking. Workshops and seminars were held to help communities better understand potential threats and how to protect themselves in dangerous situations. Emily's story was retold repeatedly, not just as a warning but as a call to action. Despite these efforts, the shadow of crime still lingers in society. While Emily's case had been closed with the criminals brought to justice, there was no guarantee that similar incidents wouldn't happen again. Law enforcement had done all they could, but crime never truly disappears. Predators like those involved in Emily's case still lurk, waiting for the next opportunity to deceive and harm innocent victims. Emily wasn't the first victim, and even though the police had uncovered and dismantled the criminal organization behind her death, the heartbreaking truth remained. There would be more Emilys if society didn't stay vigilant and act. The pain endured by Emily's family became the voice of thousands affected by sexual crimes and human trafficking worldwide. In the end, Emily's death wasn't just the tragic end of a young woman full of life, but also the beginning of new battles against injustice, crime, and the hidden brutality within society. Her case changed the lives of many, reminding us that no one is truly safe, and that we must always remain vigilant, always fight to protect our loved ones from the darkness of crime.